After decades of civil war, one man would rise to the top, Augustus. He would become emperor in 27 BC, forever changing Rome. He ruled for 40 years, and in those years he would massively expand the empire, securing his power, and would establish Rome's first dynasty. Realistically, everything he did was the best he could do. Though as great as he was, nobody is perfect. He would face some challenges and failures, some that would irreversibly affect the empire. But that begs the question, what if everything went perfect for Augustus? If you want to continue seeing more from me, like and subscribe, and comment down below if you agree with this scenario or if there's anything you would change. My goal is to hit 100 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would appreciate it if you subscribe. Now on to the video. Much of Augustus' reign was successful, so I won't change most of that. But what I do want to change is mostly in the later years and a little bit in the beginning of his reign. There are 3 subjects I'm going to cover: expansion, rebellions, and succession. There are 2 areas of interest: Arabia Felix and Nubia. Let's start with Arabia Felix. In real life, Augustus ordered Arabia Felix to be conquered in order to control the spice trade. But lack of supply, treacherous guides, harsh climate, and disease would doom the conquest. So let's change that. In this alternate scenario, the expedition is properly supplied and prepared for the climate, and Augustus could just threaten the Nabatean kingdom if their guides led the legions astray. With supply, preparation, and guides secured, now it was time for Rome to conquer Arabia Felix. This would take quite a bit as the heavy infantry marched through the desert, but eventually they would get there, defeating the neighboring kingdoms. Augustus would not outright conquer them, but instead would establish them as client states. With Arabia Felix conquered and the spice trade secured, now let's move on to Nubia. In real life, Nubia would preemptively attack Rome. Augustus had wanted to suppress them and gain tribute from them, all the while expanding Rome south to gain Nubia's gold and trade like ivory. This will fail as fierce resistance and harsh climate will lead to Augustus abandoning the idea of expanding Rome south. So a treaty would be signed and the 2 would coexist and trade with each other. But how can this be changed to be more favorable for Augustus? Well, we had to start before the invasion. The Nubians attacked Roman Egypt due to their heavy tribute and taxation. A lack of military presence at the border allowed Nubia to attack and take some cities before being repelled. So let's change that. In this alternate scenario, there are more legions at the border, and when the Nubians attack, they are defeated. We'll have Rome campaign against them as it happened in our timeline. Only this will be severe to Nubia as they have already been defeated in Egypt and the queen will likely have been captured. The region will be harsh and outright conquest will be very costly, so Augustus would turn Nubia into a client state and put a pro-Roman ruler onto the throne. With Arabia Felix and Nubia secured, Augustus' expansion is now complete and will now move on to rebellions. There are 2 key rebellions I want to talk about: the Great Illyrian Revolt and the Germanic Revolt, also known for the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Let's talk about the Illyrian Revolt. The revolt would occur after the Romans would heavily tax, conscript them for campaigns in Germania. It led to Augustus deploying an enormous amount of legions, 15 of them, to quell the 200,000 rebels, and splitting the Illyrian region into multiple provinces. It would leave Rome's borders vulnerable and would indirectly lead to the Battle of Teutoburg, as someone would use this revolt to attack Rome in a particular forest, but we'll get to that later. But let's see how Augustus could have prevented this. Well, there are really only one way to prevent the revolt, and that is to not treat the Illyrians horribly. This could be done by reducing conscription, taxation, slashing corruption, and treating those already conscripted favorably. These simple steps could have prevented the enormous revolt and as well as the devastating Battle of Teutoburg. Speaking of Teutoburg, probably Augustus' worst defeat, Teutoburg completely destroyed Rome's ambitions in Germania. It was so bad that Rome would never retake these lands again. But how did it happen? It occurred when Arminius, a trusted Roman ally, would betray Rome and organize an ambush against General Publius Quintilius Varus. He warned him of a rebellion, and when Varus arrived to where the rebellion was supposed to be, he got ambushed by Arminius and the Germans. It would result in a devastating loss, and Rome would never regain Germania again. So now here's the big question. How could this have been prevented? There are many ways, like the biggest one, not listening to Arminius. Varus was warned of Arminius' treachery multiple times, yet he chose to march on this supposed rebellion. Had he listened to the warnings toward Arminius, the Battle of Teutoburg would have never happened. Now that I've covered the rebellions, let's look at something that affected not only Augustus but the empire for the rest of its time. One of Augustus' major failures was his inability to establish a system of succession. Though it kind of wasn't his fault, as he was forced to uphold a facade of a republic, he couldn't outright say that members of his biological family would succeed him, as that would be clearly a monarchy, which the Romans completely hated. This could lead to Augustus being assassinated, but I think there can be a workaround with this. Augustus in this scenario can declare that the most qualified would become emperor, similar to the adoption system of the Five Good Emperors era. This would prevent anyone from saying that Augustus was a monarch and he could choose members of his family to succeed him, without the label of a monarch, as he can view them as being the most qualified. But most importantly, this would establish a legal system of succession, preventing needless civil wars that would occur in the future, entirely preventing events like the crisis of the 3rd century or the year of the 4 and 5 emperors. But let's move on to another aspect of succession. Succession would prove to be a challenge for Augustus, with all of his chosen heirs dying before him. He would ultimately choose Tiberius as his successor, though he would lay the foundations of the dynasty. The success of the dynasty wouldn't be so straightforward, with the peak of the dynasty being Tiberius and Claudius, besides Augustus, which should tell you how the dynasty would prove to be quite disappointing. And then there's of course Caligula and Nero, who would halt the progress of the dynasty. Overall, the Julio-Claudian dynasty would be a snooze fest compared to Augustus. So let's change that. What if instead of choosing Tiberius, he chose Germanicus? Germanicus was the preferred option in real life, but Augustus would choose Tiberius because he was the safer and more practical choice. So in this alternate scenario, Augustus chooses Germanicus as his successor. After the death of Augustus, Germanicus would prove to be a popular emperor. Germanicus would likely continue the campaign against the Germans, though it would be to pacify Germania. He might campaign to fully conquer the entirety of Germania, past the Elbe River. Then, assuming he has no children, he likely would choose his brother Claudius, as he would recognize his son Caligula as being unfit to be emperor. And so Claudius becomes emperor, who would be a decent emperor, but ultimately the dynasty will likely end with Nero, as I don't see any way for Britannicus to succeed Claudius, as Claudius favored him over Nero, and he will likely be assassinated by his wife who favored Nero. Now that I've discussed the perfect scenario for Augustus, let's now wrap it up into chronological order. The year is 27 BC. Octavian, now Augustus, becomes emperor. In 26 BC, he orders the expedition and conquest of Arabia Felix. The legions would be successful by 25 BC, conquering Arabia Felix and securing riches for Rome with control of the spice trade. In 25 BC, the Nubians will attack Egypt. With a well-defended border, the Nubians are defeated and their queen is captured. Romans would campaign into Nubia. Eventually, by 22 BC, the Nubians would become a client state with a pro-Roman ruler on its throne, expanding Roman influence south, securing valuable resources and trade. In 9 BC, Augustus would subdue the Pannonian tribes. After a decade, Augustus would reduce the harsh policies in Illyria, preventing a potential rebellion from taking place. While on his track to Germania to begin his governorship, Arminius would warn him of a rebellion occurring. Quintilius Varus would be suspicious at Arminius after being warned by an allied chieftain. He avoids where the supposed rebellion is occurring and begins his governorship in Germania. Arminius' plot is eventually discovered and he is executed for his treason. Near the end of Augustus' reign, he would establish and legalize a system of succession, stating that the most qualified military leader or statesman would succeed as emperor. Of course, he chooses Germanicus to succeed him. Germanicus could campaign in Germania, mostly quelling any rebellions, and maybe campaign past the Elbe River and conquer all of Germania. If he doesn't have children, he chooses his brother Claudius to succeed him. Overall, this scenario makes the already great reign of Augustus almost perfect. While there might be things I didn't cover, this is the best case scenario for Augustus. He completes all of his objectives and ensures Rome succeeds past him. And the dynasty he creates, like all dynasties, would eventually end. At least this Julio-Claudian dynasty has 3 out of 4 great leadership, with one exception that would be its downfall. Compared to the real-life dynasty that was unpredictable and somewhat chaotic, this altered version is much better for not only the dynasty but for Rome. And with a system of succession being established, Rome is now saved from endless civil wars that will occur in the future. In this scenario, a perfect Augustus reign will change the fate of Rome for the better. Hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you want to keep seeing more from me. And comment if you agree or disagree with the scenario, or what are some things you would change. Did I miss anything? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.